Dear members of ICJW and friends, my name is Lillian Bosboom, and I'm your host for today's event. I'm the Chair of Communication for the ICJW. Thank you for coming here today from all over the globe. We're really happy for the number of people who have registered for our first webinar. You are most welcome here today. On our webinar, you can submit your questions at the bottom of your screen using the Q&A button, and we'll try to answer as many questions as time permits. Once again, good morning, good afternoon, and now I'd like to introduce our president, Penny Connery.
Hello, welcome to this first ever webinar hosted by the International Council for Jewish Women. My name is Penelope Conway, and I'm the president of ICJW. For those of you watching who are not members, ICJW is an umbrella organisation of Jewish women's groups established in 1912 and now representing 38 different countries. Our affiliates are involved in improving the lives and status of women and girls. We promote a just society based on human rights and Jewish values. We are represented at the United Nations in New York, Paris, Geneva, and Vienna, the Council of Europe, the European Women's Lobby, the International Council of Women, and the World Jewish Congress. Our speaker today, Dr. Joan Lurie, has a doctorate in physics and has lectured widely on the use of satellite imagery in archaeology. But today she will be talking about her involvement for the past 15 years as one of our representatives at the United Nations in New York and her active role in the informal caucus of Jewish NGOs, which are non-governmental organizations. Joan learned several years ago about the controversy surrounding the education provided by UNRWA, which is the UN Relief and Works Agency, to Palestinian refugee children, and believes that the path to peace begins in the classroom. Because of the hate, anti-Semitism, and incitement taught in UNRWA schools, the caucus has become a project-orientated organization for UNRWA Stop Teaching Hate. The education delivered to Palestinian children must be changed. Joan regularly lectures on this subject, and I am delighted that she will be telling us about the work of the Jewish NGOs in this field. Joan.
Thank you very much, Penny, for that lovely introduction. Very complimentary one. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. My goal today is to show you why the path to peace begins in the classroom. And as you can see, it will not begin in the classrooms in use today in the schools run by the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. This is a picture of a school play, a somewhat inappropriate picture for young boys, I would say, in a refugee camp in Gaza, where the two young boys point the rifles at the head of another young boy whose helmet has a Star of David on it. I think the message is quite clear. So, why is this education a major obstacle to peace? The United Nations Agency, which we'll call UNRWA for the duration of this presentation, as I said before, it stands for United Nations Relief and Works Agency, runs all the schools in Palestinian refugee camp classrooms. The hate and incitement-filled texts have been largely ignored for 70 years. For 70 years, Palestinian children have been educated to vilify Jews, destroy Israel, and glorify martyrdom. Teachers have been educated in these schools as well. After all, it's 70 years. Many of them belong to Hamas, and Hamas recruits in the schools. The education and training as it currently exists is a form of child abuse and violates the Convention on the Rights of the Child. When I say every day peace remains at least 25 years away, what I mean is that unless the education changes, there will never be an adult generation of Palestinians willing to talk to Israel about reconciliation. Not a very pretty picture. Just about one chart on how we got here, or at least a theory of how we got here. In 1949, the General Assembly of the United Nations created UNRWA to provide education, healthcare, social services, and infrastructure to the refugees following the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. You may recall that Palestinians fled their homes during and after the settlement of the 1948 War of Independence and refused, well, the War of Independence was caused because the Palestinians refused to accept the United Nations partition plan for the land of Palestine. So UNRWA is still around. It's supported mainly by volunteer donations with a very small UN budget for its international staff. One of the things they have done is redefine who is a refugee. If we count up all the refugees who actually left their homes, all the Arabs who actually left their homes in 1949, there are probably about 40,000 of those people still alive today. However, UNRWA has changed the definition of refugee so that refugee status is now an inherited characteristic, and all the children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren of the refugees now number 5.5 million people, all living in refugee camps in various places in the Middle East. A very minute number have actually ever been resettled. The current budget of UNRWA is about $1 billion a year. Now, what happens to other refugees in the world? There's another organization at the United Nations called the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. They handle all refugees except the Palestinians and manage to resettle most of them. But instead of resettlement, UNRWA has been endorsing, since its inception, the right of return. The objective, clearly stated in UNRWA textbooks and in Palestinian paperwork, is to occupy all the land from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean. This is what is taught in UNRWA schools and summer camps, clearly implying the destruction of Israel. And that's what the rest of this talk will be about, basically. Okay, so as we became aware of this situation, we decided to do some research into what's been done and who's doing it, and how these books got to be what they are, and who do we trust to create translations from the Arabic that help us understand what's happening. So in Jerusalem, there's an organization called the Center for Near East Policy Research. I know some of you know who David Bedin is. Dr. Anna Ngos, who works for David, has been studying the textbooks and the summer camp curricula for over 20 years. They have been extremely generous in sharing their work with us, and we really appreciate their help. So the Palestinian Authority provides the books to UNRWA. This is something you need to remember. I said above that, just a minute ago, that the center has been studying the books for 20 years. What happened 20 years ago, in the year 2000, was that the PA, the Palestinian Authority, decided to create its own books for the use of refugee children. Before that, the children were usually educated with whatever books were used in the schools of the country where their refugee camp was. So a child in Jordan would have used Jordanian textbooks, etc. But since 2000, the Palestinian Authority has created its own books, and supposedly UNRWA, who uses them, looks them over, vets them for objectionable content and is supposed to ensure that these books adhere to UNESCO standards for education. But the revisions just keep getting more and more radical. The ones in 2019 and 2020 are the most radical. And as far as we can tell, there's very little happening that has to do with making sure the books teach decent reconciliation and peace rather than war. The delegitimization and the demonization of Israel are called for in all the books. The words Israel and Israeli are absent from the books, and the land is, quote, occupied by a Zionist entity, which must be eliminated during a war of return. The next couple of charts, I'll just show you some examples of what's happening here. Okay, so Dr. Ngos, who, by the way, has a PhD from Princeton University in Arabic studies and another one in Hebraic studies from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, he has now translated, in addition to many books, the latest edition of the Teacher's Guide. And this chart explains some of the positions in that Teacher's Guide. If the children ask, what happens after the war of return to the Jews who are still living in the land? And the quote is from the Teacher's Guide: exterminate the usurpers once Palestine has been freed. The teachers exalt martyrdom, they glorify it. Jihad is recommended highly. And on every grade, there's examples that are suitable to the ages of those children. For instance, in grade 2, the children are taught that a grandfather of the teacher was chased off the land he had worked for years. In grade 3, the little children stand up and repeat after me, I guess, from the teacher. I will sacrifice my blood for the land and exterminate the enemy's remnants. These are actual translations. Every inch of Palestine from the river to the sea is ours. The Zionist narrative is false. No map mentions Israel. Terrorists are heroes, and children are encouraged to become martyrs. Just an example from a grade 5 textbook teaching reading comprehension in Arabic to girls. An entire chapter is dedicated to the martyr, so-called martyr, Dalal al-Mughrabi, who led a team of terrorists in the massacre of 38 Israelis in 1978. I just want you to notice the actual picture of her on the left of your screen and the glamorized picture in the book on the right of your screen. She's draped in a Palestinian flag. Really amazing. Okay, next. So, what else is happening here? Among other things, the children in the summer camp are taught how to stab a Jew. See the picture? This is Danny Danon, who is the ambassador of Israel to the United Nations at a 2015 UN Security Council meeting. He emphasizes that children are indoctrinated in war, both in school and in summer camp. The problem is much broader than just the textbooks, because the teachers and the summer camps also indoctrinate in hate. It's also important to note that training of child soldiers is indeed child abuse. It's defined as such in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So here we are working at the UN, learning more and more about this, and we finally conclude that as Jewish women, we must raise our voices against child abuse, no matter where it occurs. Children should not be trained to be murderers. So one of the things we had to look at before we advanced from that position, so to speak, is how can this be happening to a United Nations member state? As we've seen already, just from our examples, a UN agency, UNRWA, is teaching the delegitimization of a member of the United Nations. That shouldn't be happening, clearly. And certainly, the schools shouldn't be advocating a war of return. So why isn't there any outrage at the UN about that? That's what really finally motivated us and made us decide we must try to do something. Why is there no outrage at the UN? The only two people who ever spoke out against this in public at the UN, in a public forum at the UN, are Danny Danon, the current ambassador of Israel to the UN, and the US ambassador, Nikki Haley, when she was still in office at the UN. Other than that, no outrage voiced in public at the UN. Okay, so what did we do? Well, what we did was we decided that the informal caucus of Jewish NGOs, which has existed at the UN headquarters in New York for probably, 25 years, should sort of reorganize itself and become a much more project-oriented organization. Now, it's interesting, those of us in ICJW were also talking about becoming more project-oriented at just about the same time. So we converted ourselves. We formed an organization, UNRWA Stop Teaching Hate. I'm one of the two co-chair people. The other one is Ellen Fauer, who is a member of Jewish Women International, another Jewish NGO. Palestinians will never negotiate while this education continues. So clearly it's important to bring this to people's attention. We also decided, because we noticed that no major Jewish organization has addressed this issue, we also decided there was a need for awareness, increased awareness. And that's how I first developed this talk that you're hearing and started giving it at a synagogue, one of our affiliates. In the next few months, I'll be speaking also at Temple Emmanuel in New York and so on. So we're trying to make people more aware, and the rest of our mission is to focus attention at the UN. And in the United States, we work with our representatives in Congress as well. So that's who we are. And we have changed, as I said, our the way we operate as Jewish NGOs. We have a steering committee of 11 members. So 11 of the 60 or so Jewish NGOs in the caucus form a steering committee which decides what we're going to do next and so on. Much of the leadership of this steering committee, I'm proud to say, comes from International Council of Jewish Women and also from Hadassah. The co-chair, as I said, is Ellen Fauer. And we're trying to get other like-minded organizations to also insist that changes be made. In another chart, we had talked about how this can go on at the UN. So once we became organized as a new organization, we decided to seek meetings with various people at the UN to see what they would tell us. The first person we approached was then the head of UNRWA in New York. His name is Peter Mulreen, and he no longer has that job. He talked to us, he and two of his assistants met with Ellen and myself. He talked with us for over an hour, insisting that they had really good standards for vetting the books, but he would never reveal them. So we didn't get too far with him. So we moved on to the Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People, which was equally discouraging. We met one person, the Deputy Director of the Middle East Division of Political Affairs, who's definitely empathetic to us. He definitely knows there's a problem, but he's not sure he can do anything about it. As we continued to look for people to talk to, we discovered that inside the UN, there is now an enormous apparatus which exists solely to support the Palestinians' goals in life. The UNRWA, as I pointed out, is not supported directly by a budget from the UN, but by donor nations. But the UN budget does support something called UNISPAL, the United Nations Information System on the Question of Palestine. They oversee the committees and so on. And they truly have an enormous budget, which I have not been able to ferret out, but I will continue to look. In addition, and this turns out to be very important, we have met with several people from the Israel mission, because for years, whenever I said to someone, why don't we do something about this UNRWA education, I was told that Israel doesn't want to rock the boat. They are very concerned that UNRWA should remain in place because otherwise they're afraid they'll have these 5.5 million people on their hands. However, what's happened now is as the education has gotten more and more radicalized, Israel has firmly recognized that UNRWA must be changed. I've spoken to Danny Danon in person, to his assistant, and they all firmly believe that we are doing the right thing, that we should continue to work toward changing this. So of course we do other things as NGOs too, and attend meetings on topics of interest. We participate actively in the Holocaust Remembrance Program at the UN. But we believe, at the bottom line, we have the right and the obligation to insist that the UN stands by its principles of tolerance. They should not be complicit in using these materials. So as we went around meeting people and so on, we asked a lot of questions, but our favorite one was, why does this education continue? And I've listed on this chart just a few of the sort of almost automatic answers we got. We can't change the culture. It's too embedded. The teachers believe in what they are doing. They teach young men like this, and I assume young girls as well, Youssef, to go around saying, I hate the Jews. And then another thing we heard was, if the children were taught reconciliation, and as opposed to murder, hate, and destruction, the parents would object. I ask you to keep that in mind as we proceed through the next few charts. Would the parents object? That's a good question. We also learned that it's very hard to change anything because of the entrenched philosophy of the right of return. If you watch films about this situation, you will hear child after child saying, we're going to get our village back. These kids, of course, have never been there. They're 3 generations removed from anyone who actually lived in such a village. But there is brainwashing happening about the right of return. Okay, so what's going on now? Well, it's been a very interesting year, not 2020. 2020 is interesting for other reasons. 2019 was a very interesting year. The UN discovered, and I'm not sure how it came out in the first place, but considerable corruption was discovered in UNRWA. Publicity in all the newspapers and the media, the mainstream media, was suddenly exploding with all this talk about corruption. Nobody talked at all about the education they provide, but at least there was attention pointed at UNRWA. The Secretary General, Mr. Guterres, knew, of course, that the UNRWA mandate was up for renewal last November 2019, and he backed the renewal. That is, UNRWA's mandate has to be renewed by the General Assembly. He asked people to vote for it, but He also asked for clauses calling for more transparency and conditions on what they were doing. He was motivated, at least partly because he did know about the books, but mostly by the corruption uncovered in UNRWA. As a matter of fact, the Commissioner General resigned after it was found out that he was buying airplane tickets, first class, of course, to travel with his mistress around the world on UNRWA business. However, despite Guterres's urging, the mandate to continue operations for the next 3 years was passed with no conditions. So here's where we are at the end of 2019. UNRWA will exist for 3 more years, at least, and the budgetary situation didn't change. That is, most of the money still has to be raised by donor nations who are approached by UNRWA. So perhaps there is still some possibility of reform, since there is still the chance, we hope, that people will hear that the curriculum is terrible and nations will perhaps hold up their donations to UNRWA. So what should some of our goals be? Realistically, one of the most important and should be easy to do, stop the paramilitary training of child soldiers. Dismissing employees who are members of Hamas may be more important, but it's also more difficult. And audit the use of donor funds, and we'll hear more about that later. Finally, a drastic, but probably the most effective, if we could do it, would be to introduce the High Commissioner of Refugees Arab resettlement standards rather than not resettling them at all, which is what UNRWA has done. Whoops. Sorry, I think I skipped one. Yes. So why are we doing this now? As I said in summary, 2 important things have happened. The Secretary General has spoken out about issues relating to UNRWA. The government of Israel has finally taken the position that UNRWA must be reformed or replaced. And although it wasn't directly on account of the books, there's been a lot of attention to UNRWA outside of the UN because of the corruption. In addition, there's more awareness right now at the UN of damage caused by anti-Semitism. As a matter of fact, there's a committee called the Committee to Eliminate Racial Discrimination. And it's a UN committee, and they have recommended that the PA change their books, the Palestinian Authority change their books to combat hate speech and incitement to violence. They said the current texts fuel hatred and incite violence and anti-Semitism. That is a true milestone, that inside the UN, someone has criticized these books. Okay, next chart. The first thing you should be thinking, or probably are thinking, is, well, let's say we got rid of all of these books. Is there an alternative curriculum available? Or are we facing an expensive long-term development of new books? Well, indeed, there is an alternative curriculum. There's a curriculum that Israel uses for Arab children in towns all over the state of Israel. It's in Arabic. It teaches peace and reconciliation. And in addition, the children learn Hebrew, English, math, and technology. These books, as I said, are already in use in many Arab towns. And the deputy mayor of Jerusalem, Fleur Hassan, who I was privileged to meet with in November, says that she would like to replace the UNRWA books with an existing curriculum, namely this one, in Jerusalem. Now in Jerusalem, in East Jerusalem, now that the city's been united, there are children in public schools who are not refugee children, but they're still using the PA books. And there's also a refugee camp within the city of Jerusalem. It's Shuafat, She would like all of those children to be taught by a different alternative curriculum we've just described. I'm going to show you a video of her in a moment, but I did want to point out first that she went out to the schools in East Jerusalem and suggested to parents at things that I imagine were much like PTA meetings in America, that the books could be changed, that children could learn more technology, more Hebrew and English, less about war. And well over 50% of the parents said, yes, let's change the books. So she conducted a small experiment, I think in 2 or 3 schools, I'm not sure exactly. And what happened was, yes, the parents liked the books, the kids liked the books, but PA officials started threatening the parents that they should call to have the PA books brought back. So at this point, it's just about when COVID started, so I'm not sure exactly where we're at. But she did go to Parliament in the UK in January, urging the UK to stop funds for UNRWA unless it agrees to change the books and stop anti-Israel and anti-Semitic incitement. This was a meeting to discuss withholding, or at least putting in escrow, a United Kingdom pledge of £65.5 million to UNRWA. Okay, so now we are ready for the video.
The international community regularly criticizes Israel for the living conditions of Palestinians. Jerusalem Mayor Fleur Hassan Nahum argues those critics are the problem, however, for funding education that incites hatred by using Palestinian Authority textbooks.
And why is that bad? Unfortunately, we have incitement in that curriculum. We have glorification of martyrdom, complete denial of the existence of Israel.
Arabs make up 37% of Jerusalem's population, and almost all of their children study the PA curriculum. Hassan Nahum says beyond the hatred, there's a practical side to the problem.
For me, as somebody here who's worried about all the children in my city, they don't teach any Hebrew and terrible English, which means that when they're 18 years old, these kids graduate, they cannot be integrated into any economic opportunity, any quality employment, any higher education here. And so what the curriculum does is a curriculum of institutionalizing poverty.
The Palestinian Authority wants its future capital in the eastern part of a divided Jerusalem. Israel opposes that idea. Most Arabs living there have resident status with many of the same privileges of Israelis.
When we polled them, 50% of Arab families want to be part of the Israel curriculum. The Israeli curriculum is an Arab curriculum. It's not a Zionist curriculum. All we're doing is taking out the incitement and bringing in Hebrew as a second language.
Many of the Arab schools are under the UN body that's taking care of Palestinian refugees for more than 70 years.
We have school books here which honor murderers throughout the books and talk about dying for the right of return. This is wrong. This is not appropriate for a United Nations agency.
Researcher David Bedeen has studied Palestinian textbooks and UN facilities for years.
Every Jewish city is replaced with an Arab name so that children grow up with the idea that there is no Israel. A Zionist entity that has to be ignored and or wiped out.
That's why Bedeen and Hassan Nahum want to see donor nations restrict funding until there's a change.
There's 54% of the funds that they will give UNRWA goes to education. We're saying something very simple. Put that on the side in escrow. Make them change their curriculum. Take out the incitement. Give them opportunity in that curriculum. Bring them technological subjects instead of hatred and paramilitary activity.
If the international community gets on board, Hassan Nahum says the impact would be far-reaching.
And there's no reason why the Arab community should not be part of the prosperity of the startup nation of Israel. And this is what we're doing here. And Jerusalem is the arena where this is going to play out, but it's going to be good for the entire country and hopefully peace and coexistence in the entire region.
Julie Stahl, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Okay, I hope you're as impressed with the mayor as I am. And now we're going to talk about a few other factors that are playing out here. So, first of all, who indeed is funding UNRWA. The total budget is almost 1 billion US, approximately half going to education. In fact, at the end of January 2020, UNRWA asked for a budget of 1.4 billion US dollars to be provided by its donor nations in the following year. That hasn't happened yet, but that's what they want. So, in August 2018, President Trump stopped all American funding to UNRWA. We had been the biggest donor, contributing 360 million US dollars. As a matter of fact, we're not exactly sure why he did this, but there were a lot of possible reasons. First of all, the influence of Ambassador Haley, as I've said before. Second of all, our Congress had commissioned a report, and the report was very negative about the schools. Okay, so where is the money now coming from? This is the point of this chart. Germany has now become the largest single donor to UNRWA, 170 million US a year, in spite of Germany's special responsibility to Israel because of past Nazi atrocities. In fact, in what sounds like it must be in a different country, German lawmakers have declared all of Hezbollah, including its political wing, a terrorist organization. And in that declaration, they cited the special responsibility of Germany to Israel. So I ask you, how can Germany be sending millions of dollars to an education system plotting the destruction and murder of the Jews? We must make our governments and our diplomats aware of this. This is a potential for another Holocaust. And nobody seems to be objecting to the fact that Germany is supporting this very handsomely. So I really urge all of you who have any influence with any politicians or diplomats to discuss this subject. I am engaged right now as we speak in an ongoing email dialogue with a German consul in New York, hoping to get more information that he's trying to generate from the German mission to the UN. But at the moment, this is where we stand. Germany is the biggest single donor to UNRWA. Okay, so what else has happened in the past few months, almost a year now? There is some news in spite of COVID. In the US, a bill concerning transparency in Palestinian education has passed unanimously in the House Committee on Foreign Affairs, but due to COVID has not yet proceeded for a vote in Congress. Remember that the books are produced by the PA Ministry of Education. They're used by UNRWA. So the money that's given to the PA and the money that's given to UNRWA support the same education. So here's some progress that's been made, at least on the textbooks themselves. In Norway, in June, the parliament voted to withhold half the funds for the Ministry of Education of the PA, pending a change in their textbooks. I mean, they were very specific. You change the books, we'll give you the money back. Under the very strong urging of an organization called Impact, there was also a major change in the policies supported by the European Union Parliament. In May 2020, there was a resolution passed voicing concern over, quote, the problematic material in the books. The resolution could affect the use of European Union foreign development funds, and they are urging the European Commission to ensure that, and then there's a quote right on your chart, no union funds are used to finance textbooks and education material which incite religious radicalization, intolerance, ethnic violence, and martyrdom among children. This is not a trivial amount of money that could be stopped because of this resolution, The EU currently contributes 360 million euro to the PA, along with an additional 130 million euro to UNRWA. So we're hoping that something will come of that. Now, in America, we no longer support UNRWA, but we do still support the PA Ministry of Education. And that's why that bill on transparency in education has real teeth behind it, because should it pass, we would stop supporting the PA. Oops, sorry. Okay. Finally, what about the right of return? Well, first of all, let me say right up front that the whole discussion of the right of return definitely deserves a whole lecture in itself. I'm only bringing it up here to show you the close relationship to the right of return, unquestionably the ultimate obstacle to peace, and education. They feed into each other. As long as the right of return is taught, it's very difficult to see how there can ever be meaningful negotiations. If you don't know her, I'd like to kind of introduce you to Einat Wilf, who has just written a book called The War of Return. It's a very interesting lady. At one point, she was a left-wing member of the Knesset, but as she worked on this problem over the years, she saw that the Palestinians will never want to accept any offer of peace. She noticed that Land for Peace worked in getting peace treaties with Jordan and with Egypt, but every time the Israelis tried to negotiate with the Palestinians, the negotiations fell apart, their best offers were refused, and so finally she came to understand that what the Palestinians really want is not achievable by negotiation. What they really want is a war to eliminate the state of Israel altogether. Now, in 2000, Arafat refused the offers made to him. In 2008, Abbas refused the offers made to him. And all of this drove Einat Wilf way to the right in her political views of the Palestinians anyway. And she has written this book that I just mentioned, in which she declares, among other things, that no negotiation should be undertaken unless the right of return is off the table. And I think she's probably right. But as I said, this is a very complicated issue. And although it plays hand in hand with an education which is supporting the right of return, the right of return in itself deserves another lecture. And finally, UNRWA and its apologists never quit, okay? No matter what goes on, no matter how much is exposed, they still keep taking the same positions. In February 2020, they published a paper on their website, demystifying the UNRWA approach to curriculum. You can read it. It extols the virtues of the curriculum. It insists that it's compliant with UN standards and so on. Dr. Greuss has fact-checked the article and uncovered fabrication after fabrication. I don't think we need to go through them all again. We've already heard about his research. But now, in March 2020, UNRWA got a new Commissioner General, Philippe Lazzarini, and he has been appointed also as an Undersecretary General of the UN. So he has the ear of the Secretary General. He needs to look at the books. He has the power to confiscate them and also, hopefully, remove the misleading article from UNRWA's website. So I think our next project, all of us together, should be that we get to him. In other words, we should all be writing letters, emails, whatever, to Philippe Lazzarini. If we have friends who are diplomats, we should urge them to do the same. Okay, so moving right along, I've now summarized in 3 short paragraphs our message to you. The education of Palestinian children must change drastically if there's ever to be a negotiated peace, and generations of Palestinian children have been taught the glory of martyrdom and to hate and kill Jews. This alone indicates that it's a huge job to do. When I said earlier that this hate and jihad is firmly entrenched in the culture, 4 generations of children have learned this in their schools. The only conflict resolution they learn is violence to achieve the right of return. So hopefully you sort of understand what's been happening and realize that there's a lot of work to do. I want to thank you for your attention, and I want to just show you a few places where you can learn more about this, including our own website. But some of the others are much more rich in resources. On the Center for Near East Policy Research, you can find literally dozens of films showing what's happening. There is a gentleman named Bassam Eid, who I haven't mentioned yet. He is the 3rd principal person at the Center for Near East Policy. He is a Palestinian who he and his family have broken away from this indoctrination, and he's trying very hard to influence Palestinians to a more sane view of the world, and many of the films are made with his advice. So again, thank you very much for your attention, and if there are any questions, I'll be glad to take them.
So thank you again for your wonderful presentation and your work to bring the situation into the public eye. We're very pleased here at the ICJW to present your work. Well, we have some questions for you. I'll try to get to all of them. Let's see the first question here on a Q&A. Just a moment, please. Getting there. Okay. Okay, Dr. Joan, I have a question. Have you identified anyone either inside or outside UN affiliate with Palestinians committed to coexistence and could be potentially allies in this work?
Okay, I see that question. Yes and no. I mean, inside the UN, there are a lot of people who whisper in our ears that they would like very much to help us, but, and this is particularly true of the gentleman I mentioned who works as a political analyst, but the overriding opinion in the UN on this subject comes from, as I mentioned, a huge apparatus that exists solely to support the view that's perpetrated in this education. So it's very hard to imagine how you can get help there. We know a lot of Congress people and a lot of other organizations that are happy to help us. In Israel, there are several. I'm not going to take the time to go through the details now, but I know that Bassam Eid, who works with David and Arnon, is certainly working with us as well. But we need more politicians, and most important of all, at least in the United States, we need to convince some of the major Jewish organizations that this is an important issue they should spend more time on. Okay, I hope that helps.
Thank you. I have another question here for you. And the question is, you have shown us how the Palestinians treat Jews Israeli in their books. Do the Israeli treat the other, for example, the Palestinians, any better in their books?
I'm happy to report that yes, the research that's been done both by Ngos and others indicates that the Israelis do indeed treat the Palestinians better in their books. They certainly don't advocate for violence. They do advocate for reconciliation, and that alone is a big help. And as I've said, in the books that that the Israelis teach Arab children, also advocate for reconciliation and also teach them, especially those who are Israeli citizens, they teach them Hebrew and English and technology and so on. So I think that alone is a treatment of the other that's completely different from what's happening in the UNRWA schools.
Thank you so much. Another question. Isn't the UN supposed to be impartial? Why is UNRWA taking care of Palestinian children? Who financed this project? So it's two questions.
Okay. Well, yes and no. It's not really two questions. It's really all one question. Going back to the founding of UNRWA. UNRWA was founded to educate, house, and watch out for the health care of the refugees. The problem that's arisen over the past 70 years is that UNRWA has redefined refugee. And so instead of having a very small number of genuine Palestinian refugees who need resettling, they've built up 4 generations worth, and they have 5.5 million Palestinians. So that's the issue, really. And as for the money, that's very shocking. UNRWA actually employs a very expensive PR firm in New York City to make its appeal to its donor nations more effective. And except for the United States of America, all the donor nations have been dutifully paying for UNRWA's work. So, and even if they don't pay for UNRWA's work very much, they pay for the work of the PA Ministry of Education, which is producing the books. So the money comes from all over the world. The UN itself does very little by way of financing UNRWA in its own budget, but they have all these other organizations.
Okay, so then I have a question here. How much money will UNRWA actually receive this year? And now that the US, it's not contributing with the...
Okay, I can't help you with this year. The 2020 budget is still in flux. But in 2019, UNRWA received approximately $800 million from all over the world. If you believe them, they're claiming, and remember their budget's online, so you can look it up, but they're claiming they made up every penny that the United States stopped giving them, and that gave them a budget of $880 million. So it's around 800 million, I'm guessing, for 2019. And of course, they're asking for extra money now because of expenses occurred on account of COVID.
Okay, I have another question. I don't know if that is similar to, it's how does the UN justify the enormous amount of money spent by various committee and agencies on the Palestinian question? And how much time is spent on the one issue?
Well, I mean, the UN doesn't apologize for it. The UN says, keep going. I mean, I know there are probably women on this webinar, at least I hope so, in Geneva, who attend meetings of the Human Rights Committee of the United Nations, which I've deliberately not mentioned here. They're supposed to look into the human rights violations of the whole world. Every year they spend more time on Israel than any other nation. And if you challenge them on it, which I have done in New York at a meeting of the committee, they will say, well, we're not criticizing the state of Israel per se, we're criticizing the way the Israelis treat the Palestinians. And that's a denial of human rights. But no other country gets investigated every year except Israel. So clearly there's something wrong at the UN, big time, but the Muslim nations are able to command a majority vote in the General Assembly, and that leads to a lot of this activity, I'm sorry to say.
Do you think that Trump's proposed deal would help to override UNRWA and reduce their power in the Palestinian territories?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the so-called Grand Plan for Peace is 192 pages long. I have not read it all, just for the record, but it can be summed up in 6 words, namely exchanging land for peace, which was the attempt of, say, Camp David and all the earlier attempts at negotiating. Replace land for peace with peace for land. In other words, if you Palestinians stop your incitement, stop your attacks, stop your planning and war of return, we will give you land and we will live with you in peace. That's the basic overriding principle. Now, I share the worries that many people have that the plan as written is somewhat naive, but it does take care of everything we've mentioned here today. And in fact, David Badin, who I've mentioned several times, he's really been very helpful, has plowed through the whole 192 pages and found the paragraph in which the education provided by UNRWA must be reformed immediately. So there you go.
Actually, I have 2 questions here. How much Arab countries contribute to UNRWA? I think you answered that, but would you repeat that, please?
Well, I'd like to repeat it and also say something I didn't say before. The Arab countries contribute to UNRWA, there's no question. If you go down the list of donors, you can look it up online. You'll find the Arab Emirates and a few other countries definitely give UNRWA money. But this Einat Wilf, who just wrote the book about the war of return, has posted an interesting warning at the end of her book. She said, right now, many Arab countries are no longer enthusiastically supporting the Palestinians. They're keeping very quiet about it in many cases. Some of them are even forming alliances with Israel. But she says in her book, let's not forget that the West, namely the European Union, is supporting UNRWA and the PA with a lot of money and very little criticism. She would like to see the EU back off this complete blanket support in order to not miss this opportunity where we're at a moment when most Arab countries are saying, okay, you guys have been trying and trying for 70 years. Now it's time to sit down at the table and negotiate. And she fears that because the Europeans and other Western countries support them, the PA will never back down. So that's my comment on that.
Okay, Dr. Joan, the questions keep on coming, and I don't know how long we've been here, but there's an interesting question here. How does UNRWA ensure that education in school books in Palestinian schools promote UN values?
Promotes violence?
UN values.
Oh, how? Oh, okay.
Is there a way the UN can?
After we had this hour-and-a-half-long meeting with the gentleman who was then the director of UNRWA in New York, he told us that they have a set of guidelines that they send out to all the school districts at all the refugee camps to ensure that they're following those guidelines. So I asked him to send me a copy of the guidelines. 18 months later, he lost his job, or he resigned his job, I don't know which, and I'm sure I don't have to tell you, I have not yet received the guidelines. So I don't know the answer to that question. That's the...
Okay, and our last question is, how can we support your work as NGOs? There's one here also that says the same thing. How can all the guests that are listening to your wonderful presentation can support your effort and your work?
Okay, there's 2 or 3 ways at least. One I've mentioned repeatedly is that if you have influence at high levels or even medium levels in your country's government or your country's diplomatic mission to the UN, please, please, please speak out about this. That's number 1. Number two is we have no source of income other than an initial donation by each of our committee members. And we're trying to maintain a high quality website and get more publicity out. And there is an opportunity to donate to us on our website, which we would certainly welcome. There's also an opportunity on the website to arrange for a speaker. And we hope that this opportunity I've had today to speak internationally will lead to more interest in your countries, and then we could help you find speakers. So, and also please don't forget to write letters. When I give this talk to a purely American organization, this was not my idea, it was Judy Mintz's brilliant idea. We give out postcards already printed with a letter to Congress people about supporting the Transparency Act or whatever else is on the floor.
Thank you so much for this first ever webinar. Like most people, I have learnt a great deal this afternoon, or this morning, or this evening, much of it very disturbing. Thank you for your in-depth analysis of the difficult situation and the depth of your knowledge, which we are very grateful for. I'm also so impressed that ICJW has such forceful women working for us at the UN, and I'm sure that we will all do everything we can to support you. And I have already taken a picture of the websites and things like that, so that when I do my next President's Update, I can send people information who unfortunately for whatever reason couldn't be here today. So thank you so much for all the work you've done for us in the past, today, and I'm sure in the future. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that wonderful, thank you. It was really terrific to do this.
Good.
So,
Okay, everyone, we come to the end of our first ICJW seminar. But before we go, I'd like to announce that the ICJW is planning to do webinars each month. Our next webinar will be with Dr. Sophia Deborah Levy about revisionism and Holocaust denial. You are encouraged to send your suggestions for topics to our president as well. The video will be posted on YouTube channel very, very soon, so we can show to our Australian participants. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Dr. Joan. Thank you, our president. We're finishing up here our event.
Can I just add, before I go, and also thank you to Lillian and David, who have been doing behind the scenes work for this. Joan and I would both tell you that we are not techie people. So thank you very much for all your help and your encouragement to Lillian and to her husband, David, who is not appearing, but is in the background. Thank you.
Okay, I agree completely that we owe our deepest thanks to Lillian and David. I am kind of a techie, but I've not really adapted or found Zoom very user-friendly, so it was really great to have them in the background. Thanks.
Thank you all for coming. And to the next webinar. Okay, ICJW. Take care. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.